The first major controversy that the early church faced was the controversy between the Jews in the church and the Gentiles in the church. So I want you to understand this controversy, because this controversy produced a lot of the material in the discussions in the Gospels, and certainly produced a significant portion of the issues that were written about in the letters that are attributed to Paul. In order to understand this controversy, you have to understand something about the various social and religious and political groupings of the Israelites in first century Palestine and throughout the Hellenistic world. In 587 BCE, this is in the Old Testament period, many of the Israelites were taken captive into Babylon. When the opportunity came some 40 years later for them to return, a few of them returned, but most of them remained in Babylon and began to settle in various major communities in the eastern Mediterranean. So there came, with the rise of Alexander the Great, who conquered the eastern Mediterranean and continued over to Western Asia, Alexander the Great, who was a Greek, conquered this region of the world and imposed Greek culture and language on it. So the Jews who were living in the eastern Mediterranean were, the word we use is Hellenized or Grecianized. They were made Greek by the influence of the Greek culture which conquered that region. So these Jews we're going to call Hellenistic Jews. They were different from the Jews who resettled in Palestine. We're going to call them Palestinian Jews. They were different in a number of ways. The Hellenistic Jews spoke Greek, which was the dominant language of the Mediterranean world, all the way up through the Roman Empire. They still spoke Greek. The Romans spoke Latin, but when they had to do business with other parts of their empire, they had to speak in Greek. So the Hellenistic Jews spoke Greek. The Palestinian Jews spoke Aramaic, which is a language very closely akin to Hebrew. So they had different languages. The Hellenistic Jews, their Bible was a Greek translation of the Bible known as the Septuagint. The Palestinian Jews continued to use the Hebrew Bible as their sacred text. The Hellenistic Jews, by virtue of their placement away from the center of Judaism, that is Jerusalem and Palestine, they had to develop parallel institutions. So the institution of the synagogue arose among the Hellenistic Jews, and they worshipped primarily in the synagogues. The leader of their worship was a new religious figure who arose in Israel, the rabbi. Rabbi is an Aramaic word that means my teacher. The Palestinian Jews, on the other hand, they continued to worship in the temple, although certain synagogues arose within Palestine as well. It was a religious institution whose time had come, who's caught on. So anyway, we have these two distinct groups of Jews within the first century world. Further, there were certain members of this Hellenistic culture, Roman citizens and otherwise, who were attracted to Judaism. And when they were attracted to Judaism, it was almost exclusively an attraction to Hellenistic Judaism, because Hellenistic Judaism, by virtue of where it was placed, was much more open to contact with non-Jewish people. The Palestinian Jews, for the most part, never went inside the house of a non-Jew and minimized their contact with non-Jews. The more religious of them wouldn't even allow themselves to touch or be in any physical contact with the non-Jewish world. The Hellenistic Jews were a little bit more open to contact with non-Jews. The word we use for non-Jew is Gentile. There were, however, two categories of non-Jews who were attracted to Judaism, to Hellenistic Judaism. There were, first of all, the proselytes. And proselytes were usually regarded as full converts to Judaism. Let me tell you, it was not easy to be a convert to Judaism. In order to convert to Judaism, you had to, A, be circumcised if you were a male, and B, follow the Jewish dietary and cultic laws, the ritual laws. Now, circumcision, even today for an adult is a difficult, painful, and debilitating surgical procedure. Can you imagine when they were using the level of tools and implements that they would have had to do circumcisions in the olden times? So for a man to be willing to have himself circumcised as an adult, that took quite a commitment. And likewise, the maze of laws, eat this, don't eat that, eat this only if it's prepared this way, eat this but don't mix it with this other thing, separate dishes, separate plates, separate utensils. It could drive somebody mad if they didn't grow up in that kind of an environment. So there were, as you would imagine, very few proselytes. There were, however, within the Hellenistic Jewish community, a number of non-Jews, Gentiles, who were attracted to the Jewish God, who were attracted to the Jewish ethical system, but did not want to go through circumcision or follow the dietary law. The Jews regarded them as ceremonially unclean, but they allowed them to attend the synagogues and sit in some of the back rows. And I suppose in the hope that maybe some of them would decide at some point to become proselytes. So if we could imagine now the range of possibilities, religious possibilities, flowing out from Judaism, we'd have Palestinian Jews located in Jerusalem and its environment. We'd have Hellenistic Jews. Then we'd have proselytes. And then we'd have God-fearers. That's the name for the figures who just kind of hung out but weren't circumcised, didn't follow the dietary law. And then a little bit further over, we'd have what I guess you'd have to call full Gentiles. Gentiles who were not attracted to Judaism, who did not take on any of the beliefs or the trappings of Judaism. Now, where does Christianity fit into this? And in order for you to understand this, you're going to have to pay very careful to the distinction between when I say Palestinian Jew and when I say Palestinian Jewish Christian, or when I say Hellenistic Jew and when I say Hellenistic Jewish Christian. Pay very careful attention to that distinction as I make some of these explanations to you. The first Christians, and I'm using the term in a general sense here to mean followers of Jesus. The first Christians were all Palestinian Jews. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. All of the original 12 apostles, they were all Palestinian Jews. The first century, not the first century, the first church that was formed in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost was made up almost entirely of Palestinian Jews. But very, very rapidly, the gospel, the message of Jesus, spread from the Palestinian Jewish community to the Hellenistic Jewish community. The first we hear of this, of course, is the day of Pentecost, when Hellenistic Jews came on pilgrimage from, as it says in the book of Acts, all the nations of the world. What probably means is all of the Roman nations of the world. And they all came to Jerusalem to worship on the Jewish holiday of Pentecost or Shavuos. And on that day, many of them became Christians and brought Christianity, again, loosely defined here, back to their homelands. And this was the first passage of Christianity from Palestinian Judaism to Hellenistic Judaism. And that wasn't a significant problem, except for the fact that all the leaders of the church were Palestinian Jews. And we see in Acts chapter 6, there's some resentment against the Palestinian Jewish leadership by the Hellenistic Jewish Christian. Let me restate that, make sure you get it right. There was some resentment against the Palestinian Jewish Christian leadership on the part of the Hellenistic Jewish Christians who lived in Jerusalem. And the Palestinian Jewish Christians, the apostles, did a really smart thing. They appointed 7 Hellenistic Jewish Christians as leaders in the church. They completely ceded their power to this group that was feeling itself to be marginalized. Talk about your affirmative action. That's just what they did. And it worked out okay. But interestingly, in the list of Hellenistic Jewish Christian leaders that were given, which by the way includes St. Stephen, who was the first of the Christian martyrs, stoned to death for his faith in Jesus, it also includes one Nicholas, who is described as a proselyte. So already very, very early in the church's history, the gospel is moving from its Palestinian center through the Hellenistic Jewish community and even beginning to touch a few other proselytes. Now, we hear of a number of other proselytes of varying degrees who convert to Christianity, but in each case it's a special case and doesn't involve any kind of a trend or movement or change in policy on the part of the Jerusalem church. Until Peter consents, and this is in Acts chapter 11, to go into the house of a Gentile God-fearer. And a Palestinian Jew would not go into the house of a Gentile. It would render him unclean. It would be regarded as a serious sin. Anyway, Peter goes into this house at the command of the Lord. He has a dream. And in the dream, he sees lowered to him in a net all of these unclean animals, these animals that are forbidden for Jews to eat. And a commanding voice from heaven says, "Take, Peter, kill and eat." And even though it's a divine voice, Peter refuses. He refuses because his religious upbringing has taught him never to eat these things which are forbidden for Jews to eat. He sees the same vision 3 times, and finally it gets into his thick skull that God wants him to do things that previously were regarded as unclean for a Jew to do. The statement is, what God has declared clean, don't you dare call that unclean. So Peter consents to actually go to the house of a Gentile, and he gives them the message of Jesus, and he baptizes them. He comes back to Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem church is scandalized. They can't believe what he's done. But he explains to them that he saw in them the same spirit which had come upon the Palestinian Jewish church in Jerusalem, and he says, how could I keep them from being baptized who had experienced the same spirit that we had? And the Jerusalem church accepted this, but I believe they still saw it as a special case. It was required that a new individual come on the scene who could manage to bridge not just the Hellenistic Jewish and the Palestinian Jewish world, but the Hellenistic Gentile world with the Jewish world. And that figure is St. Paul the Apostle. Now, Paul is uniquely situated to play this bridging role, to bring the Gentiles into the church. First of all, his Jewish credentials are impeccable. He is a Palestinian Jew, just like Jesus, just like Peter, just like the other apostles. He is not only a Palestinian Jew, he's a rabbi. He's not only a rabbi, but he's a member of the Jewish ruling council. So his credentials, his Jewish credentials are impeccable, but his Gentile credentials are also impeccable. He grew up in Tarsus, which was a city of modern-day Syria, ancient Cilicia. He spoke Greek fluently. He was classically educated in the Greek, not the Jewish educational system. And he was very comfortable and open with Gentile culture and society. So here we have this figure exactly straddling in his own life the Jewish and the Gentile communities. And God calls him to preach to the Gentiles. And he becomes, and he regards himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. And Paul's policy, which constituted a significant break with the official policy of the Jerusalem church, was to preach to Gentiles in various communities around the Mediterranean world. He made it ultimately all the way up to Rome, and some people say even made it to Spain. And in every community he went, he would establish a Gentile church. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is he was not requiring any of the members of that church to be circumcised or to follow the Jewish law. When Paul became a Christian, he realized that if the church was to insist that every person who followed Jesus had to be circumcised and follow the Jewish law, then the church would remain within the cultural and religious confines of Judaism and would not spread significantly beyond the borders of Judaism. After all, there were always a few converts to Judaism, but not that many. The requirements, the entrance requirements were just too stiff. So Paul considered himself to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And he went around the Mediterranean world and he established churches. And the churches were made up mostly of Gentiles. And he did not require these Gentiles to follow the Jewish law, to be circumcised, or to obey the dietary restrictions. And he insisted that Gentile Christians would be treated the same way that Jewish Christians were. And it worked out fine, except the people in Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians, the Palestinian Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were scandalized. And they sent messengers throughout the Mediterranean world to visit these churches that Paul had started and convince them that unless they are circumcised and unless they follow the Jewish law, they somehow cannot partake in the grace and the salvation of Christ. So Paul was furious, and he moved back to Jerusalem and confronted those who were teaching this other doctrine, and they had a big meeting, which is called the Jerusalem Council, found in Acts chapter 15 and mentioned also in the book of Galatians, and they each laid out their side. And the other side, you got to think about it sympathetically for a moment. This was a major sea change for the church, because after all, Jesus followed the Jewish law. And Jesus said, not the smallest letter or stroke of the law can ever be eliminated. And the early disciples, the apostles that he appointed, they were all Palestinian Jews, and they all followed the Jewish law. And for the most part, they continued to follow the Jewish law. The Jerusalem Council, after listening to all of the sides, gave to Paul the authority to start Gentile churches, and told Paul that he would not be required to insist on circumcision for these Gentile churches. But the thing wasn't settled, and there were people who plagued Paul throughout his career, going from church to church, trying to teach a gospel different from the one that he had presented to these Gentile believers. And many of Paul's letters, Galatians certainly a prominent one in that category, were expressly written for the purpose of convincing his churches not to return or turn for the first time to a form of Judaism. Paul's gospel was this. He believed that it was only Christ plus nothing that brought people to salvation, that there was nothing that could be added to salvation other than what Christ had already done. And he accused the people of attempting to impose Judaism and Jewish practices on the Gentile believers. He accused them of adding something beyond what Christ had already done, and this he would not allow. Ultimately, Paul won this battle. The church did not impose circumcision on Gentile believers, and ultimately the Gentile church dominated by the end of the first century. The Gentile church was almost encompassed the entire church. And at that point, the church turned against the Jewish Christian believers and forbid them to practice Judaism. And unfortunately, this becomes, in later Christian tradition, a basis for an anti-Jewish bias, an anti-Jewish prejudice that one has found all too often within the Christian tradition.